The judge thought he was sentencing just another teenager, until the kid flipped the case on its head and proved he knew the law better than anyone in the room. Judge Everett Langston barely glanced at the 19-year-old standing at the defendant's table. To him, Zion Mercer was just another teenager who had made the wrong choices. A case that needed to be cleared before his afternoon golf game. Grand theft auto, resisting arrest, open and shut. If you believe in exposing the truth and challenging the system, subscribe. There are more stories that need to be told, stories that could change lives. Be part of that change. The air inside the Los Angeles County Courthouse felt heavy, thick with tension. Every seat in the gallery was filled, the low murmur of voices rising and falling as people watched the proceedings unfold. The prosecution was already smirking, the bailiff relaxed, and even the stenographer seemed disinterested. They all thought they knew how this was going to go. But Zion stood still, hands in his pockets, chin just high enough to show he wasn't afraid. What they saw was a young man in trouble. What they didn't see, what they couldn't see, was that Zion wasn't here to be sentenced. He was here to win. From the outside, Zion Mercer looked like any other teenager. But while other kids were busy playing basketball or video games, Zion was mastering the art of the courtroom. His mother, Naomi Mercer, had been a paralegal for over 20 years, and every night she brought home more than just case files. She brought home lessons. Lessons about how prosecutors cut corners, how defense attorneys failed their clients, and how judges often played favorites. Zion listened, absorbed, and analyzed. By the time he was 14, he wasn't just interested in the law, he was living it. While his friends memorized sports stats, he memorized case law. While others played strategy games, he played mock trials in his mind, arguing both sides with himself. He could break down a courtroom exchange better than most law students, spotting weaknesses in arguments, inconsistencies in testimonies, and the subtle ways attorneys manipulated juries. But Zion never imagined he'd one day need to use those skills to defend himself. He had seen the flaws in the system, but he never thought he'd be standing before a judge, fighting to prove his own innocence. When the moment came, though, he was ready. The courtroom wasn't just a place of judgment for him, it was his battleground. And no one, not even Judge Everett Langston, was prepared for what was about to happen next. The state wasted no time building its case against Zion Mercer. Prosecutor Damian Caldwell stood before the jury, his voice steady, his confidence unwavering. To him, this was open and shut. Ladies and gentlemen, the defendant, Zion Mercer, was caught in a stolen Audi A6. Not just near it, not just around it, inside it. Caldwell turned toward the jury, letting the weight of his words settle. The police found his fingerprints on the steering wheel. Officer Travis Monroe, a trained law enforcement officer with years of experience, saw the defendant behind the wheel before the arrest. The prosecutor paced, laying out the evidence like a perfectly assembled puzzle. He painted Zion as reckless, a teenager who thought he could outsmart the law. This is not a case of mistaken identity. This is not a misunderstanding. The evidence speaks for itself. He gestured toward the crime scene photos displayed for the jury. A sleek Audi, its door flung open, the night flashing red and blue. Zion standing in handcuffs. Then came the final blow. When confronted, did the defendant have an explanation? No. Instead, he resisted arrest, fought against the very officers who protect our streets. Caldwell's voice sharpened. This isn't about a simple mistake. This is about accountability. To the courtroom, it all seemed airtight. A guilty verdict felt inevitable. But Zion remained calm, unmoved. Because while the prosecution built its case on assumptions and circumstantial evidence, Zion knew something they didn't. He was about to dismantle every single claim. The tension in the courtroom was thick, every eye locked onto the young man sitting at the defense table. His public defender fumbled through notes, voice unsteady, struggling to counter the prosecution's relentless attack. Zion had heard enough. With quiet confidence, he rose to his feet. Your Honor, I'll be representing myself. A stunned silence fell over the room. Judge Everett Langston arched an eyebrow, glancing at the teenager who had just interrupted his own attorney. Gasps rippled through the spectators, a few muffled chuckles escaping from the back rows. Some saw it as arrogance, others as sheer desperation. The prosecutor, Damian Caldwell, folded his arms, amusement flashing across his face. Oh, this should be good, he muttered under his breath. Zion's public defender turned pale. Zion, you don't! I do! Zion's voice was firm, unwavering. He turned to the judge. I know my rights. I have the legal ability to represent myself, and I'm choosing to exercise that right. Judge Langston sighed, leaning back in his chair. Son, do you have any legal training? Zion met his gaze with quiet intensity. More than you think. A few chuckles echoed through the courtroom. Judge Langston smirked. All right, Mr. Mercer, you want to be your own lawyer? Then be my guest. Zion straightened his tie and walked toward the jury box. If they thought this was a desperate teenager grasping at straws, they were in for a shock, because what they didn't know was that Zion had spent years preparing for this very moment, and he was about to turn this trial upside down. The courtroom was still buzzing from Zion's decision to represent himself, but now, as he stepped forward, his confidence was no longer just surprising, it was unsettling. Officer Monroe, Zion began, pacing slightly in front of the witness stand. You testified that you personally saw me behind the wheel of the stolen Audi a6 before my arrest. Is that correct? Monroe nodded. That's right. I saw you clearly. Zion tilted his head. And you were on duty at the time? Monroe nodded again. Of course. Zion paused for a moment, then turned to the judge. Your Honor, I'd like to request the GPS records from Officer Monroe's patrol unit that night. The prosecution visibly stiffened. Judge Langston glanced at the prosecutor. Mr. Caldwell, does the state have an issue with this request? Caldwell hesitated before clearing his throat. We'll need time to retrieve those logs, Your Honor. Zion didn't let up. He turned back to Monroe. Tell me, officer, if those logs show you were miles away from the scene during the time of the incident, what would that mean? Monroe shifted uncomfortably. That's not possible. Zion let the silence hang. The jury was watching. The spectators leaned in. The judge's expression hardened. The prosecution's hesitation was more than just a delay. It was a sign of weakness. Then let's get those logs, Zion said, his voice calm but firm. Unless, of course, the state has something to hide. For the first time since the trial began, the balance had shifted, and Zion Mercer was the one in control. Zion stepped back from the witness stand, letting the tension in the courtroom settle before speaking. He had already shaken the prosecution's case once, now he was about to strike again. Ladies and gentlemen, Zion said, turning to the jury with the poise of a seasoned attorney. The prosecution claims that my fingerprints on the steering wheel prove I stole the car, but let's think about that for a second. He took a slow step forward, letting his words sink in. How many of you have ever walked into a department store, maybe picked up a watch, a pair of shoes, or a handbag just to look at it? A few jury members nodded. Now imagine the next day that item goes missing. Should the store owner have you arrested just because your fingerprints were found on it? A murmur rippled through the spectators. Zion let the moment build before continuing. The truth is, fingerprints don't prove theft. They only prove contact. He turned back to the prosecutor. Mr. Caldwell, did the state bring in any forensic specialists to confirm when those prints were left? Caldwell shifted uncomfortably. That wasn't necessary. Zion raised an eyebrow. Not necessary? You're asking this court to convict me based on fingerprints, yet you never bothered to bring in an expert to verify them? He let the silence stretch. Then he turned to the judge. Your Honor, without expert testimony, the prosecution is asking this jury to make assumptions, and in a court of law, assumptions are not evidence. Judge Langston tapped his gavel. Point noted. The weight of Zion's argument was clear. One by one, the pillars of the prosecution's case were crumbling. Zion adjusted his tie, his expression calm but razor-sharp. He had let the prosecution dance around their so-called airtight case long enough. Now it was time to pull the rug out from under them. Your Honor, he said, stepping confidently toward the bench, the prosecution has presented this case as if my guilt is undeniable. But there's something they failed to mention, something crucial. The courtroom hushed. Zion reached for a document on the defense table, holding it up for everyone to see. This, he said, is the original police report filed by the car's rightful owner, Mr. Samuel Harrington. It contains a description of the suspect. He unfolded the paper dramatically, his voice steady but piercing. According to this report, the thief was described as a white male, approximately 6 feet tall. He turned to the jury, then pointed to himself. Do I look like I fit that description? Gasps rippled through the crowd. The judge leaned forward, clearly intrigued. Zion took a step closer to the prosecution's table. Caldwell, were you aware of this report? The prosecutor shifted in his chair, his jaw tightening. That document was not deemed relevant. Not relevant? Zion cut in, his voice rising just enough to command the room. You built this entire case on circumstantial evidence while ignoring the one piece of information that clearly proves I wasn't the one behind the wheel. Caldwell fumbled for words, but Zion wasn't finished. He turned to the judge. Your Honor, This oversight isn't just negligence, it's deliberate suppression of evidence. How can this court allow a case to proceed when the most basic facts contradict the prosecution's claims? Judge Langston studied the report, his brow furrowing. The weight of Zion's argument was undeniable. The prosecution had no answer. The entire case was unraveling, fast. Zion took a deep breath. He had dismantled every piece of evidence thrown against him, but now it was time for the final strike, the one that would shatter the prosecution's case completely. He stepped forward, his voice unwavering. Your Honor, let's make one thing absolutely clear. I was not arrested inside that stolen vehicle. I wasn't even near it. The room fell silent. Zion turned toward the jury, locking eyes with them. I was blocks away when Officer Monroe and his team decided I was their guy, not because they saw me in the car, not because they had undeniable proof, but because I happened to be a black teenager walking in the same neighborhood. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Even Judge Langston shifted in his seat, his stern expression softening. Zion continued, pressing his advantage. If I were a white kid in a hoodie, casually walking down the street that night, would I have been tackled, handcuffed, and accused of grand theft auto? He let the question linger, his words cutting through the courtroom like a blade. Prosecutor Caldwell stiffened. Objection! Sustained! The judge interrupted. But his tone wasn't firm. It was contemplative. Zion turned back to the judge. Your Honor, we've seen it all today. False assumptions, ignored evidence, and a prosecution more interested in winning than seeking the truth. He gestured toward the jury. The justice system is supposed to be about facts, and the facts here show that I was accused, arrested, and charged without a shred of real evidence tying me to that crime. Judge Langston exhaled slowly. He glanced at the prosecution, then back at Zion. The weight of the case had shifted entirely. Finally, he nodded. This court finds the charges against Zion Mercer to be baseless, he said, his voice firm. Case dismissed. A wave of shock and relief rippled through the room. Zion had done the impossible, not only proving his innocence, but exposing the cracks in a system that had nearly buried him. The gavel's echo still hung in the air, but the courtroom was already in chaos. Gasps, whispers, and the scraping of chairs filled the space as people tried to process what had just happened. Zion Mercer, a 19-year-old who had walked into this courtroom as an accused criminal, had walked out an undefeated legal mind. Reporters outside swarmed the entrance, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward. Zion, how does it feel to win your own case? One shouted. Did you expect the judge to dismiss all charges? Asked another. Zion ignored them. His focus was on one person, his mother. Naomi Mercer stood a few feet away, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. When he finally reached her, she let out a deep breath. Zion, what did you just do? Her voice wavered between fear and pride. He smirked. I won! She shook her head, eyes scanning his face. I know you did, but now they all know who you are. There was a warning in her tone. She had spent years trying to keep him out of trouble, knowing that intelligence alone wasn't always enough to protect a black man in America. Meanwhile, inside the courtroom, Judge Everett Langston lingered at his bench. He watched Zion through the window, his usual dismissive demeanor replaced by something else. Reflection. This wasn't just some reckless teenager who got lucky. No, this was something far more rare. A mind sharp enough to take on the system and win. For the first time in years, Grayson felt something unexpected. Doubt. Had he underestimated how many other young black men like Zion had been buried by a system too quick to judge? Zion stepped into the street, leaving the courtroom behind. He had proven himself today. But this wasn't the end of his story. It was just the beginning. Zion Mercer didn't just win his case. He exposed a truth that had been hiding in plain sight. The courtroom was supposed to be a place of justice, yet time and time again it had been a place of assumption, of bias, of decisions made before evidence was ever presented. Today, that pattern was broken, but not by luck. Zion's victory wasn't a miracle. It was proof that the system isn't designed to protect the innocent, it's designed to convict the vulnerable. He knew he was one of the lucky ones. Not everyone had a mother like Naomi Mercer, who taught him the law before the world taught him fear. Not everyone had the knowledge or the confidence to fight back against a system built to silence them. For every Zion who walks free, there are countless others sitting in jail cells, convicted not by facts, but by assumptions. As he walked away from the courthouse, Zion made a silent vow. He would return, not as a defendant, not as a victim of the system, but as a force against it. One day, he would stand in that courtroom as an attorney, not fighting for his own freedom, but for those who never got the chance to fight for theirs. Judge Langston, watching from the steps, saw it too. This wasn't just another case. This was a wake-up call. Zion turned to the cameras just once. "Ask yourselves," he said, his voice steady, "how many innocent people never get the chance to speak?" The world was watching now, and Zion wasn't done speaking. Zion's story is a wake-up call. Wrongful convictions don't just happen in movies, they happen to real people every day. Today, Zion had the knowledge to fight back, but what about those who don't? This case isn't just about one teenager proving his innocence, it's about a system that too often assumes guilt before seeking truth. If this story made you think, don't let it end here. Share it. Start the conversation, because the more people who speak up, the harder it becomes to ignore injustice.